Frank went to finish his work in the mine. As Frank entered a dark tunnel, he thought he heard something but decided to ignore it. At the far end of that dim passageway, Frank met his partner, Kenny. Together they had been using the mine to prepare illicit substances, but because the authorities had begun to monitor their activity, Frank and Kenny were trying to clean up any evidence. While they were busy putting things away, Kenny heard an odd noise echoing from deeper inside the tunnel. He assumed it might be the police, so both of them grabbed their weapons and set off to investigate. In the darkness, they discovered strange talismans hanging from the walls. Kenny seemed anxious, because the eerie sounds did not resemble any ordinary human presence. Suddenly, an extremely ferocious creature attacked them. Outside, Lucas grew worried when his father did not return, so he ventured into the mine himself. 3 weeks later, a woman named Julia felt nervous, as it was her first day teaching at an elementary school in that same rural area of Oregon. In class, Julia noticed Lucas acting strangely. He was constantly drawing something and never paid attention to what she was saying. Because of these odd behaviors, Lucas also became a target for bullying by a classmate named Clint. Even after school, Lucas continued to be harassed, but he remained quiet. He then walked alone through town and eventually reached the lakeside, where he saw a raccoon searching for food. Lucas picked up a large rock and ended the raccoon's life. He carried its body back home and entered a room that was securely locked from the outside. Elsewhere, after her day of teaching, Julia was startled by the arrival of her brother Paul, who had come to see her. It turned out Julia had only recently returned to their hometown after a long time away. Meanwhile, back in Lucas's house, the boy had trouble sleeping because he kept hearing loud banging from behind the door of that locked room. The next morning, Julia felt uneasy about Paul's attitude, as though he resented her for being back. She realized perhaps he was still hurt that she had left him alone when he was young. Julia apologized to him, and Paul explained how demanding his job as a law officer could be. He did not want Julia to misunderstand his demeanor. At school, Julia asked all her students to read aloud short stories they had written. When it was Lucas's turn, he stood up and shared a story about 3 bears living in a damp, shadowy cave. There was one big bear and 2 smaller ones. The big bear had always taken care of the little ones. But suddenly the big bear fell ill and its spirit became dark. One day, that big bear became more irritable and cruel. Abruptly, Lucas stopped reading and refused to continue. After school, Lucas placed a torn doll's head into Clint's bag. Clint quickly realized Lucas was responsible and confronted him. Lucas ended up with injuries, and when examined by the school nurse, old scars were found across his back, raising Julia's suspicions. She decided to look up Lucas's home records, then tried calling his house, but no one ever answered. When Julia was about to leave for the day, from a distance she saw Lucas walking alone. Curious and concerned, she followed him. She noticed Lucas staring through the window of an ice cream shop. Approaching him, Julia offered to buy him an ice cream. She tried to get closer to him personally, hoping to learn more about Lucas's father and younger sibling. Unexpectedly, Lucas refused to talk about his family at all. He walked off and warned Julia not to follow him anymore. Continuing on his way, Lucas saw crows circling in the distance. He moved nearer and found the decaying remains of a bear. Lucas picked up the carcass. Meanwhile, Julia drove out to the area where Lucas lived. She parked her car and cautiously approached his run-down house. Seeing that no one came to the door, she knocked and discovered it was unlocked. Suddenly, she heard movement inside the house, which startled her. Distressed, Julia decided to leave. Later, at her own home, Julia pieced together scraps of paper she had collected from Lucas's desk. Once she aligned them, they formed a disturbing image. Meanwhile, Lucas carefully cut apart the bear remains he had taken earlier. He carried those pieces into the locked room. Inside, a terrifying figure emerged and devoured the offering voraciously. It turned out to be Frank, displaying strange behavior, as if he were possessed by something dark after receiving his meal. A short while later, a small figure appeared in front of Lucas. It was his younger brother, Aiden. He hungrily devoured the remains that Lucas had just cut up. Lucas then heard his father, Frank, commanding him to leave right away. Exiting the attic, Lucas securely locked the room from the outside and hung a talisman on the door. Back at Julia's place, she asked her brother, Paul, who worked in law enforcement, about Frank, Lucas's father. Paul admitted he knew Frank had previously been involved with illegal activities in the area. When Julia wondered why Frank had not been arrested, Paul explained that he felt hesitant to detain Frank because Frank had custody of 2 young children after the passing of their mother. Julia then described the concerning behavior Lucas displayed at school and the unsettling condition of his home. Paul warned her not to sneak into Frank's house again without him knowing, since it could be dangerous. That night, while drawing, Lucas heard Aiden whimpering for food, sounding clearly distressed. Fearful, Lucas covered his ears and tried to pretend he heard nothing. The next morning, he set up an animal trap in the woods. While looking around, he spotted a hunter in the distance who seemed shocked upon discovering a severely damaged body on the ground. Meanwhile, at school, Julia examined the contents of Lucas's desk. She found a guidebook on how to trap different animals and another book referencing demonic lore. She also took a closer look at Lucas's sketchbook, which contained disturbing images. Julia showed them to the principal, explaining that these drawings were clear signs of Lucas's serious emotional distress and that he needed special attention. The principal, however, insisted they wait for an official assessment before any decisions could be made. Later, on her way home, Julia noticed Paul conversing intently with the same hunter Lucas had seen. Paul walked over to Julia and explained that the man, a retired law officer named Warren Stokes, had just discovered a person's remains in the forest while out hunting. That night, Lucas again brought food to Aiden, only to see their father, Frank, curled up in pain. Hoping to help Aiden, Lucas offered him some potato chips. But after eating them, Aiden coughed up a dark substance. Terrified, Lucas ran out of the room. Elsewhere, at a medical examination facility, the authorities learned that the remains found in the forest belonged to Kenny. The medical examiner, clearly unsettled, informed Paul and Stokes that the bite marks on Kenny's body looked more like human bites than animal wounds, leaving Paul confused. The next day, Principal Booth went to Lucas's house intending to speak with Frank, particularly since Lucas was currently in class. After receiving no reply to her knocks and realizing the door was unlocked, she ventured inside. Immediately, she noticed a strong, unpleasant odor. Growing more suspicious, she ventured farther in until she reached the upstairs door, secured with numerous locks. Hearing what sounded like Aiden crying on the other side, she cautiously opened it and climbed the steps to the attic. There, she found a frightened Aiden huddling in the corner. Suddenly, Frank emerged from behind and attacked her, biting her arm and neck. The principal lost her life instantly. Frank's body then began to move in a bizarre way, and something strange emerged from his mouth. Early the following morning, Paul and Stokes went to investigate the old mine where they had discovered more of Kenny's remains. Inside a tunnel, they saw several hanging talismans. Stokes seemed to recognize these objects, and when another officer retrieved a sharp piece resembling a horn, Stokes mentioned it was not from an ordinary animal but from something different. Partway through their search, Paul received a report from the principal's spouse, who said she had not returned home for 2 days. They immediately left to follow up on the disappearance. Elsewhere, as Lucas walked back alone from school, he was approached again by Clint, the classmate who often harassed him. Unwilling to confront Clint, Lucas turned around to leave. Suddenly, from behind the bushes, an eerie creature appeared, attacking Clint and ending his life. Panicking, Lucas ran away and hurried home. Arriving at his house, Lucas noticed a recently parked car. He raced upstairs to the attic and found signs of a struggle, with blood visible near the window. Spotting the principal's car outside, he anxiously covered it with a tarp and tried to wipe away the bloodstains on the floor. Meanwhile, Paul questioned Julia about the last time she had seen Principal Booth. She explained that their most recent conversation had been about Lucas and his increasingly worrisome behavior. That same night, Paul and one of his colleagues knocked on Lucas's door, but there was no answer. Lacking a search warrant, they had to leave and planned to return the following day. By the next morning at school, Clint's mother reported to Paul that her son had not come home since the previous day. Feeling that something was amiss, Julia insisted Paul check Frank's house immediately, but he could not act without an official warrant. In the classroom, Julia observed Lucas trembling with fear, which prompted her to decide on a solo visit to Lucas's home. Upon arriving, Julia was startled to see the principal's car parked in the yard. Soon after, the authorities discovered the principal's remains in the attic. They also found Frank's body, badly burned and torn open as though something had burst out from inside him. Outside, Julia held Lucas close, preventing him from entering the house. She and Paul brought Lucas to the hospital, where the doctor explained that he suffered from extreme dehydration and chronic malnutrition. Lucas was to stay overnight for observation. Julia then asked Paul to allow her to care for Lucas at her home once he was released, feeling it was her responsibility. That evening, as Lucas fell asleep, he recalled what had happened to his father after the incident at the mine. Frank had appeared to be in agony, trying to expel something from his mouth and telling Lucas he was ill. Frank then secured the attic door with several locks, instructing Lucas and Aiden to bolt him in from the outside no matter what happened. After Frank entered, Lucas locked the door in a hurry. A few days later, Frank dragged Aiden inside with him, and again ordered Lucas to secure the door from the outside. Later that day, Paul and Julia visited Warren Stokes to ask for clarity about the strange events. Paul showed him 3 frightening figures that Lucas had drawn, causing Stokes to react with alarm. He asked if Lucas was a local resident, and Julia, having read Lucas's file, responded that his family had moved to the area some time ago. Growing more perplexed, Stokes pulled out a book and pointed to a set of horns found in the mine. He explained that these were not typical antlers, but something else entirely. Then showed them illustrations of a terrifying entity called the Wendigo, a dark spirit notorious for preying on humans. According to Stokes, those who consumed human flesh became consumed by madness and possessed by this evil force, eventually turning into the Wendigo itself. Legend held that the Wendigo roamed freely, entering individuals at will, remaining eternally hungry and only growing more ravenous with each meal. After attacking its prey, the Wendigo would weaken for a time, and anyone who stumbled upon it in its vulnerable state had a chance to subdue it by removing its heart, forcing the spirit to seek another host. On their drive back, Paul received a call from a colleague who said something had been found at the edge of the woods. Rushing to the scene, Paul discovered Clint's body in a severely damaged state, as though a savage creature had attacked him. Attempting to calm the team, Paul assured them he would handle the situation and would be seeking guidance from local officials. In front of Julia, he tried to dismiss Stokes's seemingly mythical explanation, clearly wanting a more rational theory, but finding none. Julia urged Paul to take her to the hospital to pick up Lucas. Afterward, she brought Lucas to stay with her at home while Paul reported to the mayor's office. Feeling it was necessary to ensure their safety, Paul assigned an officer to keep watch around Julia's house. Inside, Lucas confided in Julia that hiding would be pointless. He believed his father would find him no matter what. Outside, the officer on duty heard suspicious noises coming from the shed. Julia also heard loud sounds from outside and saw the officer trying to contact Paul, explaining that something concerning was happening on the property. That same evening, Paul hurried back to his own house. Inside, Julia told Lucas they needed to hide. Meanwhile, the officer guarding the shed opened its door and spotted Aiden standing within. Suddenly, from behind, a sharp antler struck the officer, ending his life instantly. Not long after, Paul arrived and jumped out of his vehicle to check on his fallen colleague. While Julia was watching from inside, Lucas unexpectedly rushed out of the room. Out in the yard, as Paul inspected the officer's body, he was attacked from behind by the Wendigo. Thrown backward and nearly defenseless, Paul struggled to stand, only to face a second blow. Fortunately, he managed to reach a shovel at the last moment and fend the creature off. When the Wendigo finally retreated, Julia dared to emerge, running to help Paul. She bandaged his wound and declared that the Wendigo had taken Lucas and Aiden to the old mine. She was determined to follow them. Summoning his remaining strength, Paul insisted on assisting Julia and handed her a firearm. They quickly drove out to the deserted mine, and before heading in, Julia managed to call for backup. Seeing how weakened Paul was, she left him in the truck and entered the tunnel alone, carrying a single flare as her light. Venturing deeper, she discovered Lucas and his younger brother nearby. The Wendigo loomed beside them, devouring a bear carcass. When it turned toward her, Julia attempted to fire her weapon, but it had no effect. Thinking fast, she lit the flare, grabbed a piece of metal from the ground, and stabbed the Wendigo repeatedly. Having just eaten, it appeared sluggish. Julia managed to wound the Wendigo's neck, but it remained alive. As it reached for her again, Lucas sprang forward and pierced its chest, causing the creature to collapse. Realizing the Wendigo was still not finished, Julia seized a knife and slashed its torso, prying free a glowing, scalding heart. At last, the Wendigo went limp. Suddenly, Aiden jerked and twisted, moving in an unnatural way. Evidently, the Wendigo's presence inside him was starting to surface. Julia raised her knife, prepared to strike him, but Lucas blocked her path. In a trembling voice, Julia explained that Aiden could never be cured, and Lucas, though devastated, showed he understood this grim truth. At last, he allowed Julia to move closer to Aiden. She hugged Aiden tightly, then thrust her blade through his heart. Later, beside the lake, a recovering Paul questioned whether Julia was truly prepared to care for Lucas, especially since they could not be certain if the boy still carried any